Enrichment, Enlightenment, Transformation. Rabbi Yisroel Cotlar, the spiritual leader of Chabad of Cary, North Carolina, guides anyone who has been searching for a meaningful life and conscious living. Join our discussions about the mundane, our daily activities, and then infuse every day with a spiritual twist from the inspired sages of the Talmud and Jewish mysticism, which many call Kabbalah. We learn from the root source of all religious monotheistic traditions and delve into the symbolism and levels of meaning from biblical stories.
Couple-week break. Kimberly, good to see you, and welcome to anyone joining in online. Welcome. It's good to be back. Today is January 10th, 2017. We missed a few weeks, and one of the weeks we missed was one of my favorite portions in the Torah. So I missed the class on it. Then I'm like, at least we'll discuss it over Shabbat. Then Shabbat had the storm. So I'm still the rabbi without an opportunity to talk about it, so you'll forgive me if we do last week's Torah portion today. In truth, though, it really is relevant to this week's Torah portion as well, because it's all one long story. And in fact, the story of Joseph and his brothers, I think, is the longest uninterrupted story in the Torah. Meaning there's no, sub-stories in the middle. There's Judah and Tamar, but from that point on, it's like 3 portions straight. The details of Joseph and his brothers are incredibly long. There's more detail here to even the exodus of Egypt, to describing the slavery, and why is it so important? Why is this story so critical that the Torah spends a lot of time on it? Normally the Torah spends a lot of time, we have our questions with the building of the Mishkan, of course, but in terms of stories, this story, huge amount of time. Longer than even the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. We focus on Joseph and his brothers. And it's an open-ended question here. Why do you think it is that important? The details, the dialogue, back and forth, and it's back and forth and back.
It's very human. It's one of the most human stories, I think. And we all got brothers.
Yeah.
And we all have family interactions, although the patriarchs are also
right. They have their human stories as well.
Yeah, Jacob and family are not the end of family relation problems.
No.
Right. Anything else? Open-ended question. There's no.
It's the amazing ability to forgive.
I think, and that's what I think it's the story of Teshuvah in the Torah. Where else in Torah do we have character transformation? Openly in the text. If I ask everyone here, where in the Torah does it say, I'm my brother's keeper?
Caine and Able.
I'll say it again. Where in the Torah does it say, I am my brother's keeper?
I am.
Trick question. Trick question. Cain said, am I my brother's keeper? Who in the Torah said, I am my brother's keeper? Judah. Not exactly those words. He says, I am fully responsible for my brother. I'm my brother. Okay. I'm not going home without him. The same Judah that 2 weeks ago said,
let's throw him in the pit.
Yeah, what profit will we have? Let's sell him away. At least we'll make some money.
That was 22 years.
Okay, 2 weeks ago, at least in the Torah portion, in the Parsha. So you mentioned Teshuvah. You mentioned the story of change. Yeah, I think Torah highlights this for the 2 reasons we mentioned. Family, dealing with family, and Teshuvah. And this is the story of Teshuvah. And Teshuvah is an important theme in Torah and in Judaism. Our lives are supposed to be a life of Teshuvah, of always getting better. So I think that might be one reason why it is so central. Also, in a sense, if you take a step back and you look at the entire Genesis is family relations. Better yet, the entire Genesis is sibling rivalry. I've mentioned this before in previous classes.
That's right.
What are our sibling rivalries? We mentioned Caine and Able. Round 2 is?
Esau.
That's round 3 already.
Ishmael.
Round 2 is Ishmael and Isaac.
Right.
Round 3 is Jacob and his brother. Round 4 is Joseph and his brothers. And we don't do this often enough where we sort of take a bird's eye of the entire book. And it's clearly a theme in the entire Genesis. And the good news is there's a progression. That's the good news. Caine and Able didn't end very well.
You know something?
Murder. Well, yeah.
They don't really highlight a lot. The relationship between Rachel and Leah,
Correct.
because Rachel allowed Leah to actually be the first one to be married. She, out of sisterly love, I would assume, allowed that to happen.
But it spilled over into the next generation, meaning she absolutely had the mercy and compassion to do that, but the drama continued after that. So if we look at these 4 siblings, there is progression. We begin with murder, God forbid. That was the story of Caine and Able. The next story has some reconciliation because we are told that when Abraham does pass away, both Isaac and Ishmael are standing side by side bearing their father. So they had some moment of reconciliation. We don't see it so much in the verses themselves, but they are standing there. The next story, of course, Jacob and Esau meet, they hug, they embrace. There's some level, albeit temporarily, but the story of...
And then they separate.
Then they separate.
But they don't have any more strife.
No, no more strife.
They stay away from each other.
Well, I'm going to do my thing. Jacob says, hey, we'll meet up someday, and they don't end up meeting up. That's that relative that you say, hey, let's have lunch. And then Joseph and his brothers is not just they continue to live together or they ignore the issues, but Joseph, of course, absolutely forgives them, and it's an incredible story. And we've had classes here where we focused on the Joseph's response to his brothers. Today we're going to focus on Judah, on Judah's Teshuvah, and that line, I'm my brother's keeper. So let's begin now with that introduction, and let me just say, sibling rivalry, why would that be a major theme? Because in a sense, we got to get along with each other, and different nations of the world got to get along. So when people say there's no hope, we point to Genesis, and we say there is hope. The story of Genesis is one of progression. The story of Genesis is one where there was reconciliation, and that is really the key of the world so. What's interesting in all the stories, by the way, as well, is the younger brother versus the older brother in all of the stories. Ever notice that? It's all the younger brother versus the older brother. Ishmael was older. Esau was older. Joseph's brothers were older. And the younger one sort of triumphs, and there's that struggle. And in a sense, we've dealt with that with the world's major religions. Jonathan Sachs points this out, dealing with Judaism and then other religions coming forth and saying, hey, we're the new one that has taken your place, and the struggle that has ensued. So it's an interesting theme. So to think how Genesis can be a model for religions and nations of the world getting along, a lot of Jonathan Sachs's writings have to do with that theme.
I was looking at the definition of one word that has to do in the Bible, anthropomorphism, something like that.
Anthropomorphism.
Okay. So the definition, when they looked on the website, it goes, because this is when the Bible, when the Torah was given to the Jewish people, there was a covenant, quote unquote.
Correct.
It's like God makes a covenant, but then there is a covenant of the next covenant is with the New Testament, like how they.
That's what their claim is.
Yeah,
that is taken the place of.
Right.
And that, of course.
But it's in the definition.
Correct.
It was interesting. It's like,
so let us now begin, and we're going to do over 3 parts yet, this story. And let's read text 1a, and I apologize, my wife.
228.
228. We're going back 228. While we read this, discuss this yourself. I'm going to call my wife for a second. She had a little ice issue, so that's what I was. Give me a moment. But please start reading in the text.
All right, I'll start.
Okay.
They had just left the city and had not gone far when Joseph said to his steward, up, go after the men, and when you overtake them, say to them, why did you repay good with evil? It is the very one from which my master drinks, and which he uses for divination. It was a wicked thing for you to do. He overtook them and spoke those words to them. And they said to him, why does my lord say such things? Far be it from your servants to do anything of the kind. Here we brought back to you from the land of Canaan the money that we although what you are proposing is right, only the one with whom it is found shall be my slave. The rest of you shall go free. So each one hastened to lower his bag to the ground, and each one opened his bag. He searched, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest, and the goblet turned up in Benjamin's bag. At this, they rent their clothes. Each reloaded his pack animal, and they returned to the city.
Okay, so the story here was that Joseph's brothers were going home to bring food for their father. Without telling anyone, Joseph planted his goblet in Benjamin's cup. In separate classes, we've asked the question, why did Joseph terrorize his brothers so much? Certainly, he created a situation that required teshuvah. But do we do that to each other? Hey, Pam, I want to make you do teshuvah today. So, is that the role of us, or is that what God does? So that's a separate discussion. But in any event, Joseph did that. Yes.
Rabbi, Judy in the chat is saying the moral of these stories is have more than 2 kids. The more the merrier.
Well, Joseph and his brothers had, right? There was many, and that didn't help. But it's true. In the first 3, that was the case. Good point, Judy. So he plants the cup. It's found in Benjamin's goblet. And they just said, whoever the goblet ends up becomes a servant. And then they return back to Egypt. And Joseph says, no, I want to let you 11 go free. Only the one whose goblet was found should be my slave. You can now go back to your father. So he creates a situation in which the reverse happens from last time. Last time they sold Joseph as a slave. Here, Benjamin, who was identical to Joseph in that, what? Benjamin was also from the same mother, the favorite child who has taken the place. So he has created as best he could an identical situation. Maimonides writes, by the way, that how do we know when a person has complete teshuvah?
When you have the opportunity to do things again, you don't.
Right.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, you wouldn't take an alcoholic and put him in a bar just to do it. But that's what Joseph basically did.
Yeah, and that's a separate ethical question. Why did Joseph create the situation? But he did. He did create the situation. Last time they willingly sold him as a slave. This time the cup ended up. Benjamin was supposed to be the slave, and Judah then gives the speech of his life at the beginning of last week's Torah portion, and he speaks boldly. He comes up on 2a. He says, please, please don't be impatient with me. I know you are equal to Pharaoh, but he speaks with confidence and with a little bit of chutzpah. And he says in text 2b, why don't you read, Marty?
Now, if I come to your servant, my father, and the boy is not with us, since his own life is so bound up with his, when he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And your servants will send the white head of your servant, our father, down to Sheol in grief.
Which is like to the grave in grief.
Now your servant has pledged himself for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, I shall stand guilty before my father forever. Therefore, please let your servant remain as a slave to my lord instead of the boy, and let the boy go back with his brothers.
So I will take his place. I am prepared to be a slave. And he tells him, either way, I'm a stronger guy. That's what the Midrash writes. I'm a better servant. You're getting much more. You're getting
trading up.
Exactly. Yeah.
He was already 30 years old with 10 kids of his own.
Who? Benjamin was older. He was.
Yeah, he was not.
But he was not as strong. Judah was the strongest of the brothers.
Okay.
So Judah says, let me go instead of him.
Right.
Yeah, he was not a kid. You're right. This is
first
22 years later.
And he'd already been born.
Correct.
Yeah, he was in his 30s.
Correct.
For how can I go back to my father unless the boy is with me? Let me not be witness to the woe that would overtake my father.
Okay. So this class is going to focus on Judah's speech. Judah says, I can't go home without him, no matter what. Now, you might ask, why was it that Judah was the one that said this versus all the other brothers? Judah wasn't the oldest. Why did Judah make this speech?
He was the most honorable.
Okay, that is true.
I think he had lost children, lost a child. wasn't.
Oh, he himself lost. That's interesting. He himself lost. But the simple answer is one that Judah himself tells Joseph. We fast forward. Judah actually tells Joseph. Why am I the one speaking up, Pam?
What text is that?
The text 2c.
2c. For your servant assumed responsibility for the boy from my father, saying,
If I do not bring.
I do not bring him to you, I will have sinned against my father for.
So Judah was the one that told Jacob, I take full responsibility. And indeed, if we rewind to the week beforehand, when there was a horrible famine, and Jacob didn't want to let any of the brothers go down, first Reuben came forward, and Reuben says, let me take responsibility, and Jacob doesn't buy it. And then Judah says in text 3, Janice,
and Judah said to Israel his father, send the lad with me, and we will get up and go, and we will live and not die, both we and you, and also our young.
Because if I don't go, we're going to die of starvation, yeah?
I will guarantee him. From my hand you can demand him. If I do not bring him to you and stand him up before you, I will have sinned against you forever.
Okay. And the word in Hebrew that's used here, as well as when he's speaking to Joseph, is the word Arev. And Arev is a legal term today. And Arev means a guarantor. That is what it means, a guarantor. So Yehuda serves as a guarantor. So why was Yehuda the one making a speech? Because Yehuda was the one who was the guarantor to Jacob. Now, what is interesting is, yes, you had a question?
No, I just wanted to point out that Reuven couldn't have taken this responsibility, because when he was the one that said, let's not throw him in the pit or do bad things to him, he said, oh, my father's going to complain to me, or it's Rashi that says that. Yehuda is more ethical.
It's interesting we use the word ethical. Reuven makes some good decisions, but he doesn't display leadership, and we've discussed that in previous classes before.
To follow through, right?
Yeah, he fails to follow through. He wanted to save Joseph.
Right, but not for the right reasons. Is it Rashi that says that it was because he was afraid as the older one he was going to get blamed? Look what you let happen.
Right. Okay, but at the end of the day, he wanted to do what's right, but he didn't quite have the confidence to see it through. Rashi explains that he was waiting for the other brothers to leave, and then he would do it without much fanfare.
Oh, yes.
Without much fanfare. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. While he was away, Joseph was sold. So what is very interesting is this word Arev appears for the first time in the Torah here. Arev, Arov, guarantee. I've taken responsibility for the lad, for Benjamin. The word Arev is also seen throughout halacha, throughout Jewish law. What's the concept of an Arev in Jewish law?
The string.
String?
An Aruv.
Oh, that's interesting. An Aruv there, it's interesting. It is from the same root word.
Yeah, and the Arev is the raven.
Okay, that already I'm not sure what the raven connection would be, but I would have to think why that would have the same word. But the word in Hebrew, Arev, means guarantor. You know what? Well, at the end of today's class, we'll understand why the Aruv is also called
Hebrew, ink, incorporated be'am be'eravon mugbal.
It means
with limited, with limited guarantee.
So the first time in Jewish law there is this concept is in Elon. Elon, text 5a. Text 5a, we're going to now go into a little Talmud here. So let's just put this story on the side for right now. We're going to turn into Talmud and Jewish law. Text 5. This is from Baba Batra, which is the law of the tractate that deals with loans and partnerships. Read.
Did you read that?
Yes. Want me to continue?
Either one, yeah, you can.
Okay.
5a.
One who loaned money to his fellow on a guarantor security may not exact payment from the guarantor.
Now, that is the Mishnah. The Mishnah says you can't ask money from the guarantor. What is the meaning of that? We'll see in a moment. Keep on reading.
But if he had said, on the condition that I may exact payment from whom I wish, then he may exact payment from the guarantor.
Hold it there. That is what the Mishnah says. Don't do the next opinion yet. If you loan money and there's a guarantor, someone else co-signs, you can't go directly to the guarantor. But if in the document it says, I can go to whoever I want, then you can go to either the party or the guarantor. Now, what is the meaning that he can't go to the guarantor? Do 5b as well.
He may not exact payment from the guarantor at first.
At first. It doesn't mean he can't. It means at first. Yeah.
Only if he first demands payment from the borrower, who is then found to be a debtor in a court of law.
In other words, the borrower has no money. Yeah.
If the borrower then cannot pay, the lender can exact payment from the guarantor, as the Talmud later explains the teaching of the Mishnah in its conclusion.
Okay. So the Talmud says that a guarantor comes to play when the borrower has no money.
Yeah.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's like he's not a cosigner, he's a guarantor.
He's a guarantor. Now, the second opinion says if they write a condition, no, not the second, this, if you specifically write that I can exact payment from each of them, you can go straight to the guarantor if you want. So here is the concept of a guarantor in halakha, and it's found throughout the Talmud that whenever you take a loan, a person has the right to ask for a guarantor, and the guarantor is fully responsible in the event, of course, that the original party cannot pay.
Right.
The Talmud, though, asks an interesting question. What is the biblical precedent for the concept of a guarantor? Nowhere in the laws of finances in the Bible itself does it mention this. Now, you could say it's just a logical, you can write whatever financial stipulation you want. But the Talmud actually asks, what is the biblical precedent for the notion that when I lend money to someone, I can ask for a guarantor, and that person is fully responsible, just like myself.
And I guess that takes us back to...
And that's the answer. So the Talmud asks
Rabbi
this 5c, 5c.
From where is the law derived that a guarantor becomes financially obligated? The source is as it is written, I will guarantee him. From my hand, you can't demand him.
And this
That's
is a
what
surprise,
Judah
correct?
said to Jacob.
Because it is the same word. Where in the Torah is there this word Aruv? From here. Now, it seems a little bit of a stretch. Why? Because Judah was saying, I'm going to protect him. Judah was saying, he already exists and I will protect him. The concept of a loan, however, is that money is no longer there and someone else now has to pay up. It seems a little bit of a stretch to say that that is the biblical precedent. And indeed, there are commentators that ask this question. The Talmud, this is not a Hasidic text that says this. It's not a mystical text that says Judah is the source for it. It's the actual Talmud. The Talmud says Judah's story is the biblical precedent for the guarantor. So there are commentators that ask, isn't that a little bit of a stretch to say that because Judah protected Benjamin, so too in loans today, you're able to co-sign? It's interesting.
Rabbi, Judy's adding that Judah took responsibility with Tamar too. Also.
Yes, and that is why we're going to get to at the end of the class Judah displaying leadership and what leadership really means, that level of responsibility. Absolutely. So the fact that Judah's story is seen as the precedent for I'll use the Hebrew now, Arev, or Arov, is meaningful. And the Rebbe says that seems to suggest that an Arev is more than just a cosigner. You see, there's two different ways of looking at it, what a guarantor would mean. One would be, I borrow money from you. You ask Brian to say that in the event that I can pay, Brian owes you the money. Brian is a third party. Sorry, I include you here. Brian is a third party. He really has nothing to do with me, but we create the stipulation in which there's a loan with him to you as well. There's another way of learning out in Arov that Brian becomes me. Okay?
Wait, me the debtor or you, me the loaner?
The borrower. You actually become me in terms of this. Not just, well, let's do it in the Rebbe's words. Text 7. Text 7. Dennis, this is the way the Rebbe understands. This is going to be a little Talmudic here. So this is like yeshiva style learning. It's when you, what's it called when you spread hairs when you split hairs. There's two ways. This is very Talmudic. There are two ways at looking at the concept of an Aruv.
Okay, the guarantor's liability can be explained in two ways. One, his liability applies only to the debt, such that the guarantor commits himself to pay the borrower's debt. Two, the Arev assumes the place of the person of the borrower. Therefore, the borrower's personal obligation to repay the debt and the mitzvah associated with doing so now falls on the guarantor, who now standing in the place of the borrower.
You understand that?
No.
The first one is he owes the money. He owes the money. He is a third party, but that third party, what's splitting hairs here? The third party owes money. The second way of looking at it is he becomes me. And the same way I have a responsibility to owe the money, now Brian becomes me. In my absence, in my inability to do this, Brian assumes me. It's very similar to another concept in Hebrew called a shliach. What is a shliach?
Represent.
An emissary. What does an emissary mean?
Representative.
You become that person. You become that person's long arm. Okay. For instance, I'll give an example of the laws in the Bible about shliach. Do you know that a shliach can put a ring on a woman's finger and say, with this ring, you are now betrothed to the one who sent me. Okay, that.
Wow.
Now, obviously, there has to be witnesses that person designated him as a witness, but that is how far the laws of shliach go in Torah. The laws of shliach is they not just assume a job, but they become literally a proxy. They literally become an extension of that person.
Isn't it like your children when your children go and do stuff out? They, they behave badly. They're representing their parents in a sense. They are the ones that.
But I would assume that your children are representing them less as
yes.
responsible for them.
Can I take that a step further and think about that is how we think of a corporation?
Oh, yes, good.
Is that here?
I think so. Absolutely. I think that would work here. So the second way, and the Rebbe doesn't come to a conclusion necessarily which way it is. The Rebbe split these hairs. Now, you could ask a very good question, and that would be, if it is indeed the second way, then in the case of the loan, the person should really be able to go to the guarantor from the beginning. Right. Remember, the Mishnah only said that when can you go to the guarantor in the loan? Only if person A didn't have the money, then you can go to person B. So I think it would be a fair question to ask that if indeed a guarantor is exactly like the person, you should be able to go to them right from the beginning. It's a question.
He's not like, he becomes like the person. When the person is no longer able to.
Oh, so it only kicks in.
Yeah,
right.
Future tense.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
that's my understanding.
So there's a way to explain the second even according to that.
He's like the person when the person is no longer there. He becomes that person.
Correct.
In other words, he owes the money, he owes the responsibility, he becomes fully vested.
Correct.
Yes. I'm having trouble with that because the guarantor is more like the lender. The guarantor's got a real reason to hope that the borrower pays the money back. So he's almost aligned with the lender rather than with the borrower. So he doesn't want to stand in a place.
And that's another difference between the first and second way of looking at it. The first way of looking at it is he's aligned with the lender. The second way is I am this person. Now, you might ask, so why are we discussing this today? What does this have to do with life today unless you're a cosigner? And the Rebbe doesn't even resolve the issue. He just presents these two ways of looking at it. Well, this is relevant to our life today because there's another time that same word Arov creeps into Jewish law. And it's not just in finances. It's something that we experience very often in Jewish life. For instance, the last time you had a Shabbat meal, odds are, how many people made the Kiddush? One. What about everyone else? They also, there's a mitzvah in the Torah to make Kiddush on Friday night.
Yeah, but one person does it.
Who said that? Where does that concept come from?
The head of the household, like the head of the. Wait, isn't the head of the household lighting Hanukkah candles?
No. So for
family?
many mitzvot, if everyone, no, the obligation, we are each commanded in 613 mitzvot. Now, there's some only men, some only women, but for many it's both. So for instance, Kiddush is both. It absolutely is. So where does this notion come from that one person can do it for everyone?
I don't know. Aruv. Rabbinical.
Aruv.
So y'all say it together.
If you all say the blessing together, then everyone's doing it. But where does the notion come from that one person can do it and everyone says Amen and they're under their umbrella, so to speak? That's what happens at Kiddush. That's what happens with many blessings.
Yeah.
So the actual answer in legal Jewish law, you may have never heard this before, is this law of a guarantor. Because text 8 says as follows. Text 8, please.
All of Israel are guarantors for one another.
Kol Yisrael Arevim zeh bazeh. Each one of us is responsible, or better translated, guarantors for one another. And therefore, the fact that you have an obligation or a mitzvah to hear Kiddush isn't just your responsibility, but guess what? It's like my responsibility as well. And therefore, my mitzvah can be transferred over to you because we're not independent mitzvot. It's crazy to think of that, but
stretch.
but this, you might say it's a stretch, Pam, but this is actually incorporated into Jewish law.
So you're
in
saying,
the case of, one moment, let me get some wording over here. It's more so, and then even if someone had already done their own mitzvah of Kiddush, let's say the father was at synagogue that day and had a Kiddush after services, Marty, yeah? And they heard Kiddush. And then they come home and they want to make Kiddush for the rest of their family. Now, by the way, women are allowed to make Kiddush as well. They are, the same obligation. But guess what? That man can therefore say Kiddush again when he comes home for his family. And you might say that's a blessing in vain because he had already fulfilled his obligation of Kiddush earlier in the day. We say no. It's not. Because since his family or any other person that he meets had not, that's his responsibility. And it's not just Kiddush. There are many mitzvot in the Torah where you assist other people in doing the mitzvah, and you can even say the blessing. I run into this often. It happened to me just the other day. I was coming, Rosh Hashanah. I was coming home from synagogue, and a car stopped, and they schmoozed. They were Jewish. And I asked them, did you hear the shofar yet? No, I didn't. Can I blow the shofar for you? Yes. I asked them if, ideally, they would then say the blessings, because I had already, but they didn't want to do that. So I said the blessings for them. But I already did my obligation. That's okay. Because the fact that they did not yet hear shofar is my responsibility as well.
You can't say you're praying for everyone. It's not that.
It's like in your presence?
They have to be, I'm in. And in a sense, by the way, this is where the entire concept of a repetition of Amidah came from. It's really for another discussion, but in old days, there weren't enough prayer books or people didn't know how to read.
Yeah,
so therefore, there was one person who did the prayer of the Amidah and everyone said Amen. So you have to be there and you have to be in, and you have to, in halakha, there's a lot of laws about they have in mind that you're under their umbrella and you have in mind to be in their umbrella. But it works for, interestingly enough, it works for mitzvah obligations. It does not work for, I'll give an example. We just made a blessing over regular food, hamotzi. Right. I can't say it for you for that. Okay. Why not? You have to eat. It's your, only when it comes to the mitzvot, kiddush or hagafen or blowing shofar or these other things, that's where you're able to say the blessing on their behalf.
Well, 2 comments. I guess you have to eat the bread then if you say the blessing for me. But on Kaddish, you can pay someone to do Kaddish. How does that work? because you're basically buying their guarantee. So
that's good.
How does that work?
What he's saying is if someone's not able to say Kaddish for a loved one, there are services where they have that loved one in mind. Now, I'll be the first to say it's not the same.
But you basically pay for that person. That person's not doing it out of gratitude. You're hiring them to do it for you, right?
So typically what it is there are organizations that say that we would love to do it and we would appreciate if you'd give tzedakah to our organization. It shouldn't really be a per hire kind of thing. It's that they, as fellow Jews, want to help you perform this mitzvah. And typically it's organizations that could also use the tzedakah. The fact that it's a transaction, you're right, something's not right about that. It's more of, we'll do this for you and we'd appreciate a donation.
Rabbi.
It's not so much. Yes.
Debbie
Any questions?
Debbie in the chat is saying, but person at service must hear the blessing being said, not covered if they were in a different room.
Correct. There are laws what makes you being counted under that umbrella. It doesn't happen, you still have to be part of it. So Judaism sees us. Let's take a step back. Why does this work? Judaism sees us as one body in a sense. And therefore, it is my concern. Am I my brother's keeper? Yes, I am. We are responsible for one another. So responsible that I can even say the blessing for them. It is my issue because their lives are my life. Why? Because we believe spiritually that our souls are one. So now that we've...
And she's adding... like lighting a candle. The flame is not diminished by lighting another candle.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And that's why light is a good metaphor for spirituality. Because typically when you increase things, when you give, you lose. It's interesting you meant lighting a candle. I want to do text 10 for a moment. Okay. Text 10. Text 10. Here goes.
We ought to explain why the collective of the Jewish people are referred to as the menorah candelabra. The menorah is, as the verses state, to be made of one beaten piece of gold.
You remember that? There's the instruction with the menorah. It's a very complicated item to make. And then in the Bible it said you couldn't create all the decorations and then weld them, heat them together. It somehow miraculously, in a sense, had to be beaten out of one piece. How you do that? Ask Moshe. Bitzal. In any event, why? Because the menorah represents the Jewish people. And therefore, keep on reading.
Typically, when something is beaten, that which is above is sent below, and that which is below is above, so that everything is mixed.
In Hebrew, the word for mixed is nit arev. It's the same root word. Guarantor and mixed are the same root word. Going back to what you said, Aruv means a mixture. You've now created a combination where Brian asked earlier about a law, and I'll just explain what that is in Jewish law. In Jewish law, it discusses that on Shabbat, one of the things we don't do is carry items from one domain to another domain. Okay, there's that concept of transferring from one domain to another. So there is this whole lengthy discussion in rabbinic texts about uniting all of the homes to the point that they become like one. And what that typically is done is all the families get together, and I'll talk about a mini Arev, like on a block. That's a simpler example. First of all, we'll take a little string, and they'll put it around the area, and they'll also keep food in one of the person's house on that block, and they'll say everyone is welcome to partake of this food because this is communal food. And what they've done now is legally made the whole area one instead of many. They made a mixture of it, and that's called an Eruv, and it's a very technical, and it's debated in halakha.
Carry the meals back and forth.
You can carry any of the Shabbat necessities back and forth because now we are nit arev, now we are mixed. So the word in Hebrew for mixed is the same word for guarantor. Why? Because what really makes us guarantors for one another? Why are we guarantors for one another? Because deep down we are mixtures of one another. Okay? When we believe that spiritually, I am you and you are me, and our souls began as one cluster and then became separate, of course I'm responsible for you because I am you, in a sense. So similarly, the menorah is beaten all together, so we are all mixed up. And I think now we can finally go to text 11. So the Rebbe explains this idea, and Kimberly, I cut you off. Do text 11 as well.
So it is regarding monetary debt. On account of the principle of Arvut,
right,
that all of Israel are guarantors for one another. The borrower's duties of repayment falls on his fellow, the guarantor, as though he had borrowed the money himself and incurred this debt.
No, true, he has to sign on that. We don't say that without him signing on that, but spiritually, the Rebbe is suggesting the reason why a guarantor works is because in some spiritual dimension, the fact that someone else owes money and has an obligation to pay, you can also help in that mitzvah from repaying. Now, you have to sign your name and da-da-da, but here's where the Rebbe is suggesting that the concept of a guarantor is not just a fiscal obligation, but it's something more spiritual as well. And now the Rebbe uses this to explain the question I asked at the beginning. Why would it be that the concept of a guarantor is learned in the Talmud from which story? From a very personal story of Judah taking responsibility for Joseph.
Could that be also the connection that we're called Yehudim?
Interesting.
I think that thing goes on in the story a little further,
right?
Because of his acting in a responsible manner, etc. This is a big example of that.
So Jews are called Yehudim. You know, there are many 12 tribes. The name that stuck with us for various reasons is Jews. Jews come from the word Judah. We take responsibility for one another, and in a sense, we take responsibility for the world. It is our issue. If something's going on, we feel it is our issue. We don't just say, I'm living my life and, what happens outside of me, so be it. We feel responsibility for one another. Dennis, you were going to...
Well, my mind keeps going back to a point. God placed Joseph where he placed him. With that divine intervention.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did it through his brothers. So what's the perspective on right versus wrong and broad spectrum if it was mandated by God?
That's a very good question.
They had to make it right what they did to their brothers, but
I like what you just said. I think that only once, why was it that when did Joseph say this was meant to be and God sent me? At what point in the story did he say that? Only after they had done Teshuvah. So it's almost as if, Dennis, at what point in the story was he able to say, this was from God? He was able to look at them and say, it's all right. He had to see that Teshuvah from them. And it's almost like when someone does Teshuvah, at that point, what can happen? We can make up a new narrative. And we can say at this point, when someone does Teshuvah, this was all meant to be, this allowed me to, It's very hard, though, to say that when you haven't seen that Teshuvah. So, typically in Torah, God, on one side we say God has a plan. On the other side, we have freedom of choice. And it's a very hard dynamic to understand how both of those work together. I would say that there was a plan that somehow the Jews would ending up in Egypt. But that could have unfolded in different ways. Through their sin, they caused it to happen in this way. And through their repentance, Joseph was able to uncover the good in it. But
yeah, even in that story, you could say that part of the plan would be if the brothers didn't have a disagreement, maybe Joseph would have gotten separated from the group there and would have run into the same people that acquired him.
Exactly.
But then there would have been no teshuvah for the brothers.
Yeah. Well, are you looking for Rivka, Amanda? Try the issue behind. Oh, there she is. Rivka left. Rivka, you can leave the phone here, please, Rivka. I'll see you soon, Rivs. Yeah. So, and I want to finish now with what someone here mentioned. We're called Yehudim, we're called Jews, because we are meant to display this sort of responsibility. And that's very much tied up with Chabad. In Chabad, it's not, we very much feel that Jewish continuity and having Jews do mitzvot on whatever level is our responsibility. We feel that the future of Judaism and the fact that every Jew should engage a little bit more, that's our responsibility, because we don't just live our individual lives. We don't just live. Who is the one that feels this the most? Ideally, a leader. A leader is someone who feels everyone, who feels they are responsible for everyone. So perhaps this is where we see Judah getting the leadership. It was not that Judah was necessarily the most righteous of all the brothers, the flawless. He had his flaws. But for a leader, that sense of responsibility, that sense of I view myself as a mixture of everyone else. I'm about service. It's not about me, it's about everyone else. That is a quality of leadership. So Yehuda is called Yehuda. We are called Yehudim. And I think the take home of this is when we're really spiritually sensitive, when we're on our good days, we really feel that someone else's issue is our own. Yes?
Does the concept of shlichut and eravon go as far as shluchim being representative of the Rebbe and the movement and all of that?
So the Rebbe discusses this at length in many talks.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And he actually, when it comes to shluchim, he doesn't break it into two like we did today. Remember I broke it into two? He actually puts it into three.
Okay.
He breaks it down into three. It's beyond today. And what is the first story of a shliach in the Torah? Someone being sent to do a job? Eliezer, who's sent to find a wife. So it's in that week's Torah portion where the Rebbe talked about shlichut on three levels. And he actually, in that week, actually, every single year is the annual conference for shluchim. So it was at one of the years, and I forgot, the late 80s or early 90s, where the Rebbe broke it down into three levels of what it means to be a shliach. Is it that you're doing a job? Are you actually assuming the place? And he split into three. So that's a good question. But let's have the take-home here. The take-home today is that Judah assumed responsibility, and for that he was awarded the leadership. We have this concept in Jewish law of being an Aruv, a guarantor, and that spiritually stems from the idea that deep down we are all one. And when we do something for someone else, we are in truth also doing it for ourselves as well, which is very foreign today in the world where it's I mind my business and I don't, we live in that kind of world today. And this is fresh perspective on really feeling that someone else's tsaras are our own. All right, we will hold it here.
Debbie is adding, this is one illustration of possibility that a person can change, even a deep level of change when looking at emotion, like jealousy.
Good. And that's why, I began today, why does the Torah give so much time to this story? This is real character transformation. And it's one thing, as Debbie pointed out, to change your behavior. It's another thing that even deep down, he felt so strongly about it, and he changed emotionally as well. Beautifully put. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and God willing, we will be back next week with back on track with our weekly class. Thank you to Nissan Communications for hosting, and everyone who braved the treacherous roads to come here. Have a good one.
You're tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. And if you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section on nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Atomos.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.